energy for me has always been about big size. You know, it's been about scale. It's been about big oil on a global basis. It's been about the so-called big six here in the UK. Electricity has always been about megawatts, you know, not kilowatts. It's always been about scale. And in fact, most of my career has been defined by that. I started to work with Exxon as a young man, and of course I ended up with National Grid, you know, big organizations. But things changed. Things were changing around me as the CEO of National Grid enormously. There's no question that the big networks, you know, still supplying energy to millions of people in National Grid in the UK and the US will exist, but operations were changing enormously. And the last few years was, in some ways, the most fun part of my career. And I don't talk about big quite so much these days in my retirement, because actually things are moving completely to the other end of the scale. It's almost as if we're reversing where we were back in the 1950s, when everything was agglomerating in the developed world and bringing businesses together. And individual users of energy, therefore, I think have more power today than ever before. If you look at what's happened here in the UK, it's just remarkable. It's just incredible in a decade what's happened. And it's shifting the power. Shifting the power of people who previously, the big players, definitely had the power. And people talk about the energy transformation, which for years I've always said, don't use that word, that's just not true. It's a revolution. Transformation sounds like some well-planned, step-by-step. You know, this is a chaotic revolution. And that's not a negative. I think that's a real positive. The Energy Institute, all its fellows, talk about 4 themes at the moment. They talk about the 4 Ds: decarbonisation, decentralisation, digitisation, and democratisation of energy. Not bad headings in my view. Let me just touch on decentralisation to start with. This has gone from big to small, as I said, in 10 years. Yes, things are still connected into the networks, but solar and wind, as many of you will know, don't connect to the national grid as the big generators used to. 50% of our energy now is carbon-free, and all that generation has been pushed really deep into the networks, really deep into the distribution systems. So when I was retiring from National Grid, it was quite extraordinary that at times of the day, 40% of the power that was being generated in Great Britain was invisible. You couldn't see it. It was coming into the local networks. It was solar and it was wind. It was all small stuff. 40%. There was a weekend in March last year that you probably remember in the media for the first time ever, that the demand was lower in the afternoon than overnight. Lower in the afternoon than overnight. How can that possibly be? Well, it's because we had 13 gigawatts of solar in the system, that's why. So the real demand on the transmission system and generation has flipped on its head uniquely. And people, including myself, were just shocked at how quickly this happened. 2015 was the pivotal year, actually, when we built the best part of 10,000 megawatts of solar here. Today, as I said, we've got 13 gigawatts of solar. There were people in the energy industry and big companies, certainly 10 years ago, who would have said, that will never happen. It's impossible. Not because of the economics so much, but because we just can't handle that degree of uncertainty and intermittency on the system. And of course, they were wrong. What's caused it is lots of good subsidies. The government get a bad rap at times, I think, for putting too much subsidy in there. I spent my life saying, you can't ever get it perfectly right, but boy, did it work. You know, it really ignited, sparked off, to use fun, a new industry and transformed it in a matter of a few years. And now we've got PV, pretty competitive, onshore wind in the UK, probably actually the cheapest source of generation available today. And the cost of all that stuff has just come down unbelievably. You know, the scaling up has just been remarkable. That's not just true in the UK, of course, it's true everywhere else as well. But it is intermittent. And we're managing that now, and one of the things I'm doing now, I work a lot on battery companies as well. So, you know, there's great forecasts of just how much storage, which I'm sure is something that you're thinking about as businesses as well, we're going to have in the UK. The pundits, of course, have got, as usual, enormous spreads from 2,000 megawatts of storage by 2035 to 12,000. Sure, in my view, we're going to have a lot more storage than we've got today. And again, it's about finding the right economics and the regulation to make sure that that really takes place. Again, huge changes. But the most exciting thing was the flip from what I call a supply-side industry onto a demand-side industry, which is, of course, where an awful lot of you come in. When I was still with National Grid in 2015, we launched a campaign called Power Responsive, trying to encourage people to take much more active use of their own consumption of energy and play a part in helping us flex demand. History was never on our side. I'm looking around this room and I'm realizing that I'm probably the oldest person in the room, but there were people of my generation who, when you mentioned flexing their demand, went right back to the 1970s, went right back to Arthur Scargill and the coal strike and the 3-day week and candles, and thought, we can't do that. We can't have blackouts. It took quite a while to get people to realize, no, we're not talking about switching your power off. We're talking about flexing your consumption and saving us billions, literally billions of pounds of unnecessary investment in our energy systems, etc. And that's taken off more slowly than I would have liked, but certainly it's gaining huge momentum now. I think the last count, there were about 800 organisations who were signed up, who were contracting there. And it wasn't just industries, it was government organisations as well. Hospitals, lots of hospitals were playing a big part. I remember Colchester signing up to a flexibility contract that meant they saved £100,000 a year. Serious amounts of money actually by playing a part in that. And the combination of this intermittent supply now, but being so much smarter and more flexible on our demand is absolutely the way that we'll keep our energy costs down in the future, and we'll get the decarbonisation going, of course, as well. And what's so exciting is, of course, in this space that is different to this big, a huge number of startups and innovators. People coming in, really challenging the old ways of doing business and challenging all the big boys to a great extent, actually, and realizing that energy flows are two-way, as opposed to the way we built these big systems, that it was going to start in the middle and flow out to the edges. So it is a revolution. And it's a revolution, of course, that's going to be led, in my view, by people like yourselves, who are the commercial energy users, really setting the pace and the direction for the future. So I'd plant with you 3 thoughts, I think. Thoughts that I suspect, given your jobs, you're already well on top of. But thinking about local generation that's near your businesses, and storage, and how that can support your business. One of the businesses I'm involved in, having lots of conversations with big industrial and commercial organisations that are worried about both security of supply and costs. And battery storage might well be an economic answer for some of those bigger businesses. Understanding the fact that this power shift is my second message, that actually the power is shifting appropriately into the hands of consumers, and how can you take opportunities in the new markets that are evolving and the new organisations that are actually active in those markets as well. And you mentioned just earlier, Luke did in his introduction, of course, the IPCC. And it's actually the 10th anniversary of the Climate Change Act in the UK today. And I was asked to take part in something that's published this morning by the Energy Institute, which is the Climate Change Act at 10 report. And they've interviewed 10 people, actually, who were involved 10 years ago in different positions, energy minister, et cetera, in that. It's a fantastic piece of legislation, because behind so much of what I've mentioned, what's going on, has been driven by that piece of legislation. So there's a report available, if you're really interested, on the Energy Institute website today, of the interviews with these 10 people reflecting back on how it came about and the changes that have actually happened. And Ben's going to talk in a minute as part of BEIS about how they see things. And I'd leave him with a message as well, to a certain extent, which goes back to something I said earlier. What the Climate Change Act is a great example of is a facilitatory piece of legislation. And a lot of people in the energy industry constantly ask for, we want energy policy and we want detailed plans. And my observations are that is the last thing that we need, actually. In the democratization and decentralization of energy, what we need is facilitatory legislation that allows businesses and consumers to innovate. Because it's pretty clear that once you do that, some pretty remarkable things happen. And they're not happening because there's a master plan at the center that is dictated. So for you people in particular, I think that you can drive the transformation. You can drive the transformation because there are new markets that you can play in, and you can make huge changes. You just got to go for it, actually, and grab hold of it. Thank you very much.